At the beginning of creation, humanity was commissioned to steward all of it. When sin entered the world, that relationship was broken. Today, we see the devastation through natural disasters on every continent. Pollution, oil spills, creation groaning for the return of its creator, and the first to suffer from environmental decline is always the poor. Tri Robinson was the founding pastor of Vineyard Christian Fellowship of Boise and one of the early American evangelical pastors to call the church to environmental stewardship in the face of toxic political squabbles.
Well, I mean, it's a huge issue, environmental decline. Almost everything touches it. In fact, if you talk about, going upstream in I61, we talk about going up to the source of a lot of these problems. One of the very top tributaries would be the environmental crisis. I mean, when you pollute people's drinking water, it makes them sick. When they get, they get sick, they get desperate, and I mean, it's like some of the worst things that we face today really are environmentally caused. And today we have, for example, this issue of climate change, which a lot of Christians around the world, or at least in America, I'd say, have kind of rejected it as being a legitimate crisis. But it's a very legitimate crisis as we see the polar caps melting, the sea levels rising. It's changing weather patterns in the United States this year. I mean, the amount of natural disaster from weather alone has been horrific. And the people that end up suffering from that, not just financially, but there's a loss of life. And that's in America. But if you start going to other countries, into the third world, the developing world, places like Bangladesh, where you see what sea rise is doing, it's taking away their crops, their ability to grow food, and they're now having to migrate. And so the world is going to be seeing in the next few years a major environmental refugee movement on the earth. And already the earth is having a hard time figuring out what to do with all these refugees. So the environment is huge. It's not just about losing whales and polar bears, although it is, and seals and everything, everything that is wonderful on this earth. But it really is about what it's doing to the extreme poor. And it's ultimately a matter of injustice, especially if there's something we can do about it. Let's use Haiti for an example. Haiti is the poorest nation in our hemisphere, not the poorest nation in the world, but it's a neighbor to America. Recently there was a hurricane that came through and it devastated the place. It devastated crops. But one of the things that's happened when people get poor, they'll do anything to keep their families alive. One of the things they did in Haiti is deforested their own country to make charcoal so that they had something to sell. It was their only really resource. Well, when that happened, then the monsoons came, or in this case a hurricane would come. It washes the topsoil off and destroys the crops, makes it impossible for people to produce their own sources of food. People become desperate, even desperate to the point that a farmer, a poor peasant farmer, may even give up a teenage daughter into prostitution in a place like Port-au-Prince to keep the other 3 kids alive in the family. And so one thing actually creates another. And downstream, we're looking at human trafficking, we're looking at health issues, we're looking at, these are the bodies that are floating down that river. And in the past, the church has, in compassion, has gone and has made hospitals for the sick. It's made schools for the illiterate. It's done what it could do, rescue houses for trafficking. So it actually, it comes in kind of after the fact, and with compassionate heart tries to rescue dying and dead bodies that are floating down this river, when really the church should be upstream. It should be up those tributaries, cleaning up the water, helping people with their soil so that they can grow food, taking care of some of these environmental problems so that, that chain reaction doesn't take place.
For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
He said, man's without excuse from knowing God because He's revealed Himself through all that He's created. His divine nature, His eternal power, all those things. The nature of God is nature itself. And in nature, if you look at nature, it's a picture of restoration. It's a picture of reconciliation. It's a picture of renewal. I mean, God is in the business of making all things new, even now. I mean, you cut yourself and you actually are programmed to heal. That's the nature of God. You look at the environment, you see a river that gets polluted. If it's left to itself, it's actually programmed through its sand and rocks and the downhill trajectory to actually purify itself, if left to itself. A forest fire, it burns, and looks devastating at first, but in the next year it's beautiful because it actually renews itself through the natural process of God. So God's in the business of restoration and renewal, and He wants that for us, but He also wants it for His creation. And when He made the covenant with Noah, the Noahic covenant or the covenant of the rainbow, after the flood, he comes and He speaks to Noah and He says, I'm going to make this covenant with you and I'm going to put the rainbow to remind you of this covenant. A lot of people look at that and they if you read it, it's in Genesis 9. They think, well, this is a covenant between God and Noah, or maybe it's a covenant between God and man. But it's actually a covenant between God and His whole creation. And he repeats 7 times in this one short passage of Scripture that this is my covenant between mine and every plant and every animal and man. But man is given responsibility over this covenant, that we are called to be stewards of it. And then if you look but all the way into the Gospels, because a lot of people say, well, that's Old Testament, but if you actually look into the Gospels and you actually see in the whole dissertation of Jesus about the last days, then right after that, there's 3 or 4 parables, boom, boom, boom. He said it's going to be like the last days of Noah, if you recall. People are just going to be, eating and drinking and marrying, and, they're just going to be carrying on life, and then the end's going to come. And he says, and then he goes right into these parables. A lot of people have felt that, hadn't really seen the connection, but these parables actually are a carry-on of Matthew 24. And he talks about stewardship in all 3 cases, the one of the talents, the one of the, the steward of the land, and that unexpectedly this master is going to return and will judge based on how those that were put in charge and those that were given resources, how well they did, taking care of God's stuff. Then it goes into in the next chapter, Matthew 25, it goes into the separation of the sheep and the goats. And then that's where Jesus so famously says, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat, I was thirsty and you gave me drink, and I was cold and you clothed me, and I was sick and you visited me. Well, if you look at that, and then they said, of course, the disciples said, when were you ever sick or cold or hungry or thirsty? And He said it, as you did it to the least of these, meaning the world's poor, you did it unto me. Like, this is a ministry to Jesus. Well, reading that on the heels of this kind of the picture of the last days, and really, we're in this time between the first and second coming of Jesus. It is the last days, and we're living in this moment that it's true. We are saved through faith by grace, but for good works that were ordained for us to do or predestined for us to do from the very beginning. We're to engage in the ministry of Jesus and carry that on, and especially among the poor. It's pretty clear. Well, a lot of those issues are environmental issues. water for sure. I mean, look at Flint, Michigan. That's injustice. 100,000 people, they were told they couldn't even wash their hands in the city water. And you look at the Indians in the Dakotas that are trying to protect their drinking water. That's a justice issue, because this water is this great, incredible resource that this earth has. And there's, what we have right now is all we ever get. The only water that we have is the water that's always been there, the water that always will be here. And being stewards of that water is more crucial than having oil for our automobiles. And there's coming a day, honestly, if we're not good stewards, there's going to be more wars fought over clean water than over all the oil in the world. You can live without oil. You can't live without water. And so the church needs to understand and get this bigger worldview of what's really going on this earth, and not be deniers of climate change, not be deniers that this stuff is actually going on, and being short-term, having short-term vision, saying, I need my stuff and I need it now, and I'm not really thinking of generations down the line. And as some have said, it's all going to burn anyway, so who cares? It's not really what the Bible says. Not all. He says he's going to use it like the flood. And the flood, this is 2 Peter 3. He says it's the flood, it said he's going to destroy the earth with fire as he did destroy the earth with water. Well, if you recall, God did not destroy the earth, he destroyed sin, and he renewed the earth. That's the nature of God. And if he does the same with fire, which is another cleansing agent, he's surely going to rid the earth, of sin and unrighteousness. But he's not going to destroy the earth. This is the only earth we get. He's going to renew the earth because that's who he is. And he's called us as his people to participate with him as a steward of caring for this. And I'll tell you something. He says, when he comes, there's going to be this separation like sheep and goats. And the ones who provided the water, the ones who provided the food. And by the way, that's food is a major environmental issue. It's scary, the direction that the world food supply is going. With the use of chemicals, the use of GMOs, the use of all these artificial means just to try to prop up, the food supply for really short term, because long term it's not sustainable. You've got to take care of your soil. You've got to take care of your water. You can't just poison it with chemicals. You can't get away with that forever. The church needs to be leaders in this because we've been commissioned to do it. I remember there was a campaign going on at that time. It was the Bush-Gore campaign. And I have 2 adult kids at that point. And we were sitting around a dinner table one night, and like you shouldn't do, we got in a political discussion. And both of them rose up and said, you know what? And they were angry, they were upset. They said, we have no one to vote for in this election. And I said, what do you mean? I mean, it's like, we're evangelical Christians. And almost everybody in those days would have voted for the Bush campaign. And they said, we feel like if we vote one way, we're voting against the sanctity of life, and we won't do that. And if we vote the other way, we're voting against the environment, and we're not going to do that. Now, the funny thing was I raised my kids in the mountains. I mean, every summer we were on horseback in the backcountry. We lived on a ranch, really a wilderness ranch, raised them in the environment. They loved creation, and they could not understand, in fact said so. They said, we've been raised in church, and we have never once in all the years of our life, and they were probably 30-ish at that point, they said, we've never heard one message by any pastor on environmental stewardship. And I got challenged, and I actually went and got my Bible. I actually spent the next 6 weeks with a green felt tip pen and underlying everything about creation, everything about the environment, which there's an awful lot of it. And it took me 6 months to get the courage to actually preach a message to my own church. I did a series of 3. And it probably wasn't the best teaching I'd ever done. I was pretty nervous. I thought I'd get tarred and feathered and thrown in the street. Boise, Idaho is a capital city, and it's a very red state. And we had a lot of political people in the church. And yet I got standing ovations we had 3 services in those days, and we had standing ovations at the end of all 3 services on the first day I preached. Literally put tears in my eyes. I realized then that Christians in the seats of churches are waiting for this. What you don't experience, you don't really care about. What you don't care about, you're not going to do anything about. So I realized, first of all, I grew up, in my generation, we didn't have any money. When I was a kid, for vacations, we went camping. My dad took me hunting, my dad took me fishing, my dad took me backpacking. But today, kids don't have that. So one of the things that I realized is, first of all, I had to remind people of how much they care about the outdoors. So I asked everybody to get family pictures, a picture or 2 or 3, of a picture of their family in the out of doors at some point where they were having a good time together. We started building backcountry trails for the Forest Service, working for the Fish and Game. We started doing river cleanups. We started doing things that our neighbors started recycling cell phones. We can't just preach a message. We have to provide opportunities for people to participate and play. You can't, I don't think it's right to even preach about what Jesus says about the poor if you don't provide, some ministry to the poor in your community or even out into the world. Well, the same is true with the environment. Leaders have to do what I did. They have to look to the Word, they have to look to the Lord, they have to look to what's going on in the culture around them, and they have to quit being so afraid to communicate something that's very clearly the heart of God.